welcome along. My name is Fran. I'm the volunteer officer at the Courtauld. It's my pleasure to introduce you to our Conway Storytellers today, who will be sharing with you stories, some of them for the first time. So please do give them a warm welcome. This evening, our storytellers are Dana, Gill, Dora, Fran, and Norman, and we're going to hear a story from each of them. And then we'll have time for a Q&A or just a chat at the end of the event. So please feel free to ask questions using the chat box during the event. You should be able to find the Q&A chat box by pressing a button that's near the bottom of your screen. This event is being recorded, so you'll get a chance to rewatch it or share it with your friends later. During the event, your microphone and your camera will be switched off, and everything is managed by our technical team, so don't worry about being seen or heard. So the event today was jointly inspired by photographs from our photographic collection and by the wonderful Layers of London project. So I'm also extremely pleased that we're joined today by Professor Matthew Davies, who's the Executive Dean and Professor of Urban History at Birkbeck and Director of Layers of London. And that project is hosted at the Institute of Historical Research. So you'll be hearing from Professor Davies very shortly. Just to introduce you to our digitisation project, which all of our volunteers contribute to. So in usual times, volunteers at the Courtauld are based on site at Somerset House on the Strand in Westminster. And here are just a few of over 1,000 people who have helped us over the last 3 years. And the Conway Library itself is a library of art and architecture in the basement of Somerset House. And we've got 1.5 million photographs that are kept in these red boxes. When we are allowed to access the library, our volunteers have been very busy hand labeling and photographing the collection so that eventually we can share it with the world. Here you can see some of our volunteers in action back in 2019. So our volunteers come from all walks of life, and we have no minimum pre-existing skills or knowledge requirements. Obviously, we haven't been able to go to the library very much in the last year, so we've been organising online activities that are keeping up our project aims of sharing the collection with the world. And our volunteers used Layers of London between March and July 2020 to share our photographs in advance of our collections website going live. So this evening's event grew out of wanting to reach an even wider audience and to show off the fabulous Layers of London website that anyone at all can access. So maybe you will be inspired to visit or even use Layers of London yourself for research, for inspiration, or to share your own photos and memories. Or maybe you'll just want to go and explore the map. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Professor Matthew Davies to introduce the Layers of London project and tell you a bit more about that. So thank you for joining us, Matthew. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Fran. Thank you for the kind welcome. Could you show the first slide? Thank you. That's brilliant. Well, it's really great to be joining all of you this evening. And I want to start by saying how excited we are at Layers of London about this collaboration. It's really fantastic for us. And as all of you know now, and we'll see more later, the Conway collection is so fantastic and amazing in terms of the photographs of London. And so it's great to be able to work together to put them online as part of Layers of London. So I just wanted to start by very briefly telling you a bit more about Layers of London, and also perhaps most importantly about how you can be involved in the project. So if we can see the next slide, please. So first, what is Layers of London? It's several things really. It's first of all, it's a website with more than 200 different maps of London that allows you to explore the history of the city through maps that cover the history of London from the Roman period right through to the present day. And to do that, you can overlay maps on top of each other as a way of seeing how the city as a whole or your own neighbourhood has changed over the centuries. So in this case, we've got a 16th century, mid-16th century map on top of a modern one with some of the pins that have been created by users. But actually one of the most important feature really for many of us is the fact that anybody can contribute to the website. So in other words, you can create your own layers of London history, whether it's collections of images, memories, stories about your own area, or about a topic that interests you, such as migration or the London Underground, parks and gardens, controversial buildings, or almost anything you can think of about London. And what we want to try and do is to open up London's history to people and communities right across London and even in other parts of the UK or further afield, so that we can get access to many different kinds of histories and sources. And so far we have more than 10,000 records on the website. So please do come along and explore and add your own. And then there's a sort of third strand of the project has been to run sort of engagement events, which obviously focus mainly on using and contributing to the website. But we also looked at how you can use maps of different kinds, what you can get out of, for example, the aerial photographs taken of London by the RAF in the late 1940s. And if you go along to our YouTube channel, you can see there's a great collection of about 25 different videos now, which take you through different themes, different maps, and different things you can do with Layers of London, whether it's for your own local project or just to explore the website. So if we go on to the final slide now, one of the really important parts of the project has been working with partners, and the Courtauld and the Conway Library is really one of those. And we found fairly early on in the project that there was really huge interest on the part of libraries, archives, and other organisations to use layers as a way to make collections more accessible. And maps provide a really good way to do that in terms of telling different kinds of stories about London. And so because of that, we've been able to connect to work that the Courtauld and others have been doing to digitise collections. So as well as the Conway Library photos, for example, we've got hundreds of photos from the London County Council archive. And linking those to a map means that users can explore particular streets or neighbourhoods, or see records that have been created by different people about the same buildings. So ultimately, for us, Layers of London is about sharing stories about London's history and heritage. And that's what the Conway collection does so fantastically well. So I'd like to end by thanking all of those involved in the project, especially the volunteers and the staff who created the collection. I'm really looking forward to hearing more about it from the Conway storytellers themselves. So thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Matthew. What a great introduction to Layers of London. I hope that some of you are feeling inspired to go and check out the website after today's event. All of the photographs that our storytellers will be talking about feature in our Conway collection on Layers of London, so you can go and have a look at them for more details after today's event. So on with the storytelling. I'm going to introduce each storyteller as we go along. And first of all, we have Donna Moreno. So Donna studied dress history at the Courtauld, and she works in museum partnerships and programs for the past 4 years, alongside volunteering with us. She is passionate about accessibility in arts organisations, and she enjoys stories about people and places. And Donna will be talking about a photograph of 25 Old Bond Street in London. So over to you, Donna.
Thank you so much, Fran. Hello, good afternoon, everybody. I'm so happy to be here and talk a little bit about this lovely image. I chose this image because I was immediately intrigued by it. The picture is of the storefront of the leather goods brand Loewe on 25 Old Bond Street, like Fran just mentioned. And I chose this image as I felt like it was something I could relate to. Maybe not the luxury goods side of it, but as a fellow Madridian, this is because Loewe was a purveyor of leather goods to the crown in Madrid from the 19th century. So I found myself immediately asking questions about this image. When was this photo taken? Who are those stylish women walking down the street, right? What is there today? Because it's been a long, long time since I walked down Old Bond Street. So just to start with this little talk, I would like you to share with us in the chat below, if you know the answers to those questions. Have you shopped in Bond Street before? And most importantly, do you like shopping? Do you miss shopping? Do you know the context of this image? I believe the history of London is tightly linked to the history of fashion and shopping, from local markets to luxury shopping, and those are tied to London's inhabitants and visitors from the Roman times to today. There's actually evidence of a Roman settlement where today it's actually Bond Street. And fast forward to the 18th century, the street began to be popular with the bourgeoisie living around Mayfair. There is a quote that I really like that says, by the end of the century, an upper class social group known as the Bond Street loungers had appeared, wearing expensive wigs and parading up and down the street in a pretentious manner. I'll leave that with you because I found it quite funny in a way and interesting and kind of parallel of what we can see today in some streets in London. And then, so by the 19th century, Bond Street increased its reputation as a street for luxury shopping. If you visited London today, chances are that you've probably passed by number 25 or the beautiful Royal Arcade in number 28 that goes towards Regent Street. And today, really, or at least until we entered our first lockdown this time last year, the shop in that very place in 25 Old Bond Street is Tiffany's. And so that and Bond Street have both remained synonymous of luxury shopping. So let's go back to the image. I'm curious to know what you think. So please do share with me in the chat. The first thing that that catches your eye about this picture. For me, the first thing that caught my attention was the beautiful dark facade that was also built in the 19th century with the Loewe letters and the store in the center. And it's flanked on the left side by Elizabeth Arden, and on the right side, watchmaker G.W. Benson. I'm not sure if you can see the letters on the right. But this wasn't really the first Loewe flagship store in London. This one, the first shop opened in 1963 in Mayfair's Mount Street. So probably this was the second location during the late 60s and early 70s. And going back to the people that we see in the image, I can see this smartly dressed doorman, which shows us how luxurious the shopping experience might be in these kind of shops. I'm not sure if you've ever been let in by a doorman when you were shopping, but it's quite an experience. So walking down the picture, we can also see a group of young women fashionably dressed in winter styles from the late 60s or early 70s. If you can see kind of like the scene walking down the street, possibly having purchased some cosmetics at Elizabeth Arden or a luxurious handbag at Loewe, or maybe they just went shop hopping. What do you think they're doing? I like to imagine what they would be doing. So yeah, fashion has shaped the look and life of our high streets in London and cities really around the world for over 200 years, and the way that we consume fashion now, obviously. And now with the COVID-19 pandemic, this has changed the way we consume fashion completely. Like, for example, the rise of loungewear or elasticated waistbands. Tell me what you think about these. I'm not a huge fan, but I do have to admit that they're pretty comfy. So as a consequence, this has changed the way we look, the way we use, and they're shaping the high street, really. And finally, I would like for you guys to not only tell me, but to discuss what do you think the future of fashion shopping is. We've seen a massive shift to online shopping. The whole experience of going from shop to shop has completely changed in the past year. And as you can see from last week's cues, some people do miss it. I personally don't miss it, but some people certainly do. It is uncertain how fashion and the retail sector has been ultimately changed. And we are still to see the consequences of this pandemic. but not only in the way we dress, in the way we shop, and how this evolve in the near future. And I think this is such an important and such an important conversation, and such a nice thing to think about, and the ways we consume. But yeah, I'll leave it to you, and I'll just leave Fran to continue with all the talks. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Donna. I can see some good questions and comments coming in on the chat. We had a couple of people who were familiar with 25 Old Bond Street and already knew that Tiffany's was there. And awesome. Yeah, love the Bond Street lounges as well. Who would love to be one of those? So on to our next speaker. Next we have Gill Stoker. Gill has lived, studied and worked in London since the mid-1970s. She studied at Birkbeck and at King's College London, just next door to the Courtauld, and she taught for the Open University's London region for over 21 years. She started volunteering at the Courtauld during lockdown 1. And Gill will be talking about a photograph of the Royal Courts of Justice in the Strand. So over to you, Gill.
Thank you, Fran. Thank you very much. So hello, everyone. I'm Gill, and I'm looking at this photo of the Royal Courts of Justice in the Strand in central London, which contains the High Court and the Court of Appeal, and it's not that far from the Courtauld. The photo was taken by Anthony Kirsting in 1998 from across the road at a sideways angle. And Anthony Kirsting is one of the major photographers in the collection. So the building itself was designed by the architect George Edmund Street in the 1870s in Victorian Gothic style. And it was opened by Queen Victoria in 1882. And it's now a Grade 1 listed building, the top level of listed buildings. So you can't see from this photo, but the facade is wide. It appears to be symmetrical at first glance. But then you begin to notice different details at the ground level to the left and right of the arched entrance. And the arched entrance is on this photograph just on the left to the right of the tree trunk. So you can only see the sort of right-hand half of the arched main entrance. So the building is quite ornate with pointed turrets, a central rose window and a spire. And then inside there's a great hall, so-called, which is a bit like being in a big church or really a cathedral, except without the pews. It's just a big open space. It has a high vaulted ceiling, a patterned tiled floor, Gothic arches and columns, and some stained glass. And perhaps if you watch the popular television series Law and Order UK, starring Bradley Walsh and Harriet Walter, which is being repeated over and over again at the moment on television, you will often see the inside and outside of this building from different angles as it's used. It appears in the filming of that series. So looking a little bit more closely at the photo, if we have a close look at the pavement there in front of the arched entrance, you can see groups of people on the pavement outside the main entrance. And to me, they look like probably news teams with filming and recording equipment. So they're probably waiting for the result of some big legal case. ready for televising on the news. As you've probably noticed, the building does appear on the TV news quite often, with people coming out and being interviewed about the case they've been involved in. Okay, so just zooming out again, I'd like to share with you a story, and it's a famous example of an appeal case, which I remember from my own teenage years in the early 1970s. And it was when 3 young magazine editors, Richard Neville, Felix Dennis, and Jim Anderson, were convicted in 1971 of publishing pornography under the 1959 Obscene Publications Act in a popular countercultural magazine called Oz, spelt O-Z. So there was a big media circus surrounding the case, which was very high profile at the Old Bailey. And they were given a harsh sentence, up to 15 months in prison, which was felt by many people to be unfair. And then once they'd gone to prison, another shocking item I remember, well, shocking for me anyway, on the television news, was that these 3 young men had had their long hair forcibly cut off in prison. As I'm sure you know, long hair for younger men was very fashionable at that time in the early 70s, as it was the hippie era. So anyway, there was an appeal against their conviction, and the appeal took place in this building, the Royal Courts of Justice. And miraculously, perhaps, their sentences were overturned and they were free to go. And there were big crowds out on the pavement to cheer them as they came out. And I gather, having done a bit of research, my curiosity about the haircuts, I gather that their hair was still quite short by the time of the appeal. It hadn't grown back yet. So they made up for it by wearing wigs, long wigs. So I suppose that would be something they had in common with all the judges and lawyers in the building. Anyway, that wasn't quite the end of the story for me, because years later, in around 2007, I was doing a bit of background work on feature films as a background actor, sort of. And I took part in a film called Hippie Hippie Shake, starring Sienna Miller, based on the true Oz story. And we filmed some of the scenes both outside and inside this building. Unfortunately, the film itself hasn't been released. There were some artistic differences and also objections from living people depicted in the film. I had better not mention any names because I don't want to be sued. So anyway, the filming activity was an interesting experience, and perhaps the film will eventually be released one day. There is a Wikipedia article about it. If you'd like to find out more, just look out for Hippie Hippie Shake film, and you should be able to find it quite easily. So just a few thoughts to end with. When this building was built, the Victorian age, it was an age of progress, of rapid technological development, legal reform, and social change, very dynamic and forward-moving. But the architect Street, who designed this building, was primarily a church architect. And I think it's interesting that the Victorians chose the centuries-old ecclesiastical Gothic style for secular buildings, such as this one. Some other examples would be St Pancras railway station and the rebuilt Houses of Parliament after the fire, both of them rather cathedral-like in appearance. And I guess you could argue that the Gothic style is big and impressive, intimidating even, intended to create a sense of awe in the viewer. And that perhaps buildings where important business takes place also need to create a strong impression. The Gothic and classical styles are still recognized today as high status architecture, and perhaps modern architecture with all its quirky shapes and angles and its steel and glass, perhaps it still hasn't quite found a way of replacing the older styles. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jill. We've had some fabulous comments coming through, including somebody who used to work in the building and has told us a bit about the inside. And another person mentioned the trial before you even got to it. So people are on the same wavelength, obviously. Please leave any questions in the chat box or any comments, and we can come back to them at the end of the event. So thank you, Jill. So the next speaker that we have is Francesca Vine. Francesca graduated from the Courtauld last year and is now the curatorial assistant at the Quaker Tapestry Museum. She's also the founder of the online arts magazine, the London Art Review, and the virtual gallery, Presence Art Gallery. Fran is talking about Trafalgar Square on the eve of World War II and the pivotal shifts it has undergone between then and now, encouraging us to think about how famous landmarks change unexpectedly over time. So take it away, Fran.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction, Fran. I chose this photograph of Trafalgar Square in 1939, taken by Anthony F. Kirsting. As a place that I visited every couple of days throughout my degree, it looks extremely familiar, yet at the same time, oddly foreign, as indeed it is temporally. I personally find places that have changed ever so slightly over time to be some of the most fascinating. The National Gallery looked much as it does today, yet on second glance, the section in front of the entrance is not yet pedestrianised, but remains a road. There's a row of trees that do not exist today, shielding this from the centre of the square, which appears to be undergoing construction or renovation work, with the fountains sectioned off. The sweeping steps down from the gallery to the fountains have not been built yet. Indeed, these were only constructed as recently as 2003, when the pedestrianisation of the square took place. Despite the extra road, there is barely a car in sight, in sharp contrast to the frequent traffic jams of today. On a sunny summer Sunday, the day before the August bank holiday, the square should be teeming with families, yet it is suspiciously empty. A small group of people are feeding the pigeons in the bottom right-hand corner, but there are barely any other figures in sight. One of the most instantly striking elements of the image is the billboard on the base of Nelson's column, loudly proclaiming, "National Service, it's up to you," a tone that does not suggest much of an element of choice. This explains the atmosphere of unease which the image inexplicably conveys. Taken on the 27th of August 1939, this photograph was just a few days, exactly a week in fact, before the official outbreak of World War II, when Britain and France declared war against Germany on the 3rd of September 1939. A version of this poster is in the Imperial War Museum, which shows the wares above a man's arm filling out an application for enrolment in the army with his name, surname Willing, initials MR, Mr. On the south side of the base of Nelson's column is a poster with further details about the perks of the nursing service. Women formed a huge part of the wartime workforce. By 1943, there'd be 74,000 members of the Women's Royal Naval Service, or Wrens, serving in the UK and overseas. Wrens played a major part in the planning and organisation of naval operations and were also based at Bletchley Park, operating machines used in code breaking. While thinking about change, the war, of course, was a sudden and drastic alteration, and the square has placed host to other major events, famously a hotspot for protests and demonstrations from the 1968 anti-Vietnam War demonstrations to the various protests and marches last summer. But while large events shape our memories of a place, especially a landmark, subtler changes also occur over time. People no longer tend to feed the city pigeons, seeing them instead as vermin, or at least a nuisance. The buildings were much grimier back then, and Nelson's column is almost black with soot. A photograph such as this can show us how far we have come in terms of reducing air pollution in London. My own father has stories of going up to London in the 60s and 70s and being choked by fumes, his nose blowing black. As part of the consistent efforts to clean up the air in Trafalgar Square, in July 2003, a huge project to transform it was completed. The North Terrace was completely pedestrianised so that the square is now linked seamlessly to the National Gallery, with the central stairs added at this point. Besides this, the other obvious feature of the image is the renovation work being carried out on the square's fountains. They were placed in Trafalgar Square in 1845, with the original fountains designed by Sir Charles Barry, who is particularly known for his design of the Houses of Parliament. The fountains were built of Peterhead granite, which came from Stirling Hill, a coastal village above Bodham on the North Aberdeenshire coast. The quarry produced high-quality granite and was mined commercially in the 18th and 19th centuries. They were built by MacDonald and Leslie of Aberdeen, a firm which revolutionised the production of granite monuments and became Scotland's most important granite sculptors, with high-level commissions. The fountains were fed with water from an artesian well in Orange Street, behind the National Gallery, and another in front of the gallery. In the late 1930s, it was decided to install new fountains, designed by Sir Edwin Lutens, with a new pumping system, because the water flow from the artesian wells had become unreliable, owing to increased demands. The fountains were placed in their original quatrefoil basins, which had been designed by Sir Charles Barry. The rebuild was interrupted by the war, with the official opening postponed. This comes across in the photograph. Everything has abruptly ground to a juddering halt, and life as it was is frozen in time, to be released only at the end of the war. The construction abandoned, the streets hushed. The completed fountains were only formally unveiled 9 years after this photograph was taken, on the 21st of October 1948 by His Royal Highness the Duke of Gloucester, with a dedication service conducted by the Archbishop of Canterbury. The original fountains are now in Regina, Saskatchewan, and Ottawa. In Regina, the fountain is set between the Legislative Building and Wascana Lake. It's in a starry state, with only a dribble of water emerging and a very putrid pool. The second fountain, however, is in a much better state and stands in Confederation Park, Ottawa, as a memorial to Lieutenant Colonel John Bye. To conclude then, we have seen that while landmarks can be altered in character by ephemeral and medium-term events, such as a day's protest or the Second World War, so too can more subtle changes occur, some for the better, some for the worse. As a parting thought, I would warmly encourage you to take a look at a local landmark, urban or rural, in London or elsewhere, and compare it to an older photograph. What changes can you see? What stories can you discover? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fran. Please do leave your comments in the chat. When was the last time that you visited Trafalgar Square? Do you have any memories of attending any of the events or protests that Fran mentioned? So thank you very much, Francesca, for your story. So our next speaker is Dora Williams. Dora is a visual artist, and she holds a master's in fine art from the University of Gloucestershire. She has been volunteering for the Digitisation project since 2019, and she has chosen a photograph of the Crown Public House in Aberdeen Place in St John's Wood. And this picture gives Dora the opportunity to reflect on the artistry of photography and the changing faces of London. So Dora, over to you.
Thank you, Fran, and good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk about the Crown Public House and Hotel, which is located in Aberdeen Place in St. John's Wood. The building was designed in 1898 in a Northern Renaissance style by architect Charles Worley. The grandiosity of this style reflects the entrepreneurial ambition of Mr. Frank Crocker, who commissioned and owned the Crown. Crocker's enterprise is typical of the spirit of the Victorian age. Frank Crocker built the Crown Pub and Hotel, speculating that the terminal of the Great Central Railway was going to end near the pub. In expectation of big business, he spent lavishly to fit it out. The Crown had a concert room, a restaurant, a billiard room with a raised stage where people could watch the game. The pub area was divided into 5 compartments, which included a ladies' bar. However, Mr. Crocker's ambitions were deflated when the railway terminal ended in Marylebone and not in St. John's Wood. The Crown was a railway hotel without a railway. Business did not rise to expectation, and the Crown was later referred to as Crocker's Folly. This color photo is included in the Conway collection and was taken by André Goulancourt, published in Architecture Design magazine in 1978. This image has captured my attention because of the painterly feel that diffuses throughout. The chiaroscuro effect of this image creates a mood, a visual storytelling. The photographer might have taken this photo on a late afternoon when light is low and at an angle, which creates more dramatic shadows. The photograph invites us to look around the room. The sun shining through reveals the rich spectrum of hues: ochre, yellow, green, brown, a tinge of red in the lampshades. The light and shadows highlights the ornate plasterwork in the ceilings, the ornate leaded windows, the columns, the patterned plaster on the wall. We notice the empty bar and most tables are unoccupied. 2 coats hang onto a column. As we wander around the room, we notice in the shadows on the right at the bottom, an old guy sit at a table with a dog by his side, and on the table 2 glasses of beer. It might be the color palette or perhaps the atmosphere of this interior that brings to my mind Edward Hopper, Nighthawks. The painting depicts a late night scene in a New York diner. The 2 images are from different times and places, but I sense and recognize a common ground, one of urban emptiness and vulnerability. Hopper's work captures the feeling of loneliness and isolation that can be experienced in the middle of a crowd in large cities. Hopper had a fascination with architecture as well as shadow and light. His paintings compel us to look at architectural forms and the relationship that his solitary figures have with their surroundings. Equally, in this photo, the man's presence suggests both loneliness and the old man's relationship with his surroundings. This makes us reflect on the role of the pub as a place to connect and socialize. When we look at the old guy, we might ask ourselves, was he alone enjoying an afternoon drink? Did he bring his dog with him? Was he a local pub goer? Did he engage in a conversation and share a drink with the photographer? We shall never know the answers to these questions, but the scene let me think at the fleeting interaction between the artist and the sitter, as I see this photo the same way as a piece of art. The Crown is a listed Grade 2 building. It closed in 2004, and this could be part of a trend in the pub sector. The pub's role as a center for the community has diminished. Also, our behavior has changed since the rise of social media. The time we spend connecting virtually with other people has increased, but has reduced the face-to-face interaction. And we may ask if this virtual exchange is really satisfying for humans. Does this increase loneliness? In a dense urbanized area like London, loneliness is a real issue. Isolation has worsened during the COVID pandemic lockdown. Some pubs have reacted to social isolation, supporting local communities. They've done this by delivering meals. They've organized virtual events like pub quizzes and even virtual beer tasting. Pubs could generate social identities for local communities by helping to connect people who might otherwise have remained anonymous neighbors. Hence, the pub can be a place to alleviate social isolation. After the Crown closed in 2004, it was redeveloped by transforming the hotel rooms into luxury apartments. The pub business reopened in 2014 as a Lebanese restaurant and trades under the name of Crocker's Folly. All the interior original features have been conserved, and the room that we see in this photo still functions as a bar. Outside at the front, a sitting area with pots of olive trees creates a Mediterranean oasis in the middle of London. The Crown's stunning interiors is often been used as a film set. Amongst them, Georgie Girl in 1966, Reds in 1982, and in 2012, the pub appeared as a wartime bar in Captain America. The Crown has survived for 123 years. It is remarkable that the Crown has preserved its architecture, its heritage, and has adapted its business to the shifts of London's ever-changing society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dora. The chat has been really lively throughout your talk. People enjoying the comparisons with Hopper. Somebody said they immediately thought of Hopper when they saw the picture. And even somebody who, what did they say? That it was their family's local pub. So we have some memories coming through on the chat. Thank you so much for sharing your stories today. So our final speaker is Norman. Norman Bailey, sorry. Norman is an applied theatre practitioner specialising in storytelling for social change, as well as a volunteer at the Courtauld. So we're delighted that he also tells stories for us. For Norman, stories are thought experiments which help us to make sense of our place in the world. He'll be telling a Windrush generation story inspired by a photograph of Chase Lodge in Clapham, South London. His story is based on real events, is peppered with verbatim testimony, and uncovers some hidden layers of London life. So over to you, Norman.
Thank you, Fran. Hello, everyone. Hope you can see me. I can see Fran. My story will be a hero's welcome. Transfixed, Barnsley Peterson stares at the door of Chase Lodge in Clapham Common Doorside. The door stands out because it's one of the few on the Chase that's at street level. He thinks about the family inside. He wonders what they are eating, if they are sitting by a warm fire, or if they have warm beds to sleep in. And he thinks about his own family so far away in Jamaica, a family he left behind to follow his dreams of a new life in England. With just 2 weeks' notice, Barnsley waved goodbye to his wife and young daughter and set sail for England on the Empire Windrush. After 22 days at sea, the Empire Windrush pulls into Tilbury Dock. Barnsley feels a sense of deja vu. He's made this journey before. At the outbreak of World War II, Barnsley answered a call for volunteers to defend freedom and democracy against fascist oppression. He made his own way from Jamaica across 8,000 miles of U-boat infested waters and arrived in London, walked to the Air Ministry, knocked on the door and said, "I've come to join the Royal Air Force." Throughout the war, Barnsley flew Spitfires and rose to the rank of squadron leader. The fight won, Barnsley returned to Jamaica. When in 1948, the invitation goes out again for British citizens to help rebuild war-torn London, Barnsley once again answers the call. On June 21st, 1948, Barnsley once again sets foot on British soil. He disembarks to what he feels is a hero's welcome. He even gives a TV interview. Then Barnsley and some of his fellow passengers board coaches for their lodges in Clapham. As they make their way to their new home, Barnsley puts pen to paper and writes a letter to his wife. "My darling Audrey, I write to you with great excitement. My voyage was long, but there was a carnival atmosphere on board. The Windrush was packed with colorful characters from all over the world. There were boxing matches, singing and dancing, but of course I took no part in any of this and I was in bed by 8. I will write to you again when I'm settled in. Kiss little Esme for me. Tell her daddy is safe and well in England, and I hope that we will all be together again soon. All my love, Barnsley." The coast passes Chase Lodge and turns into Clapham Common north side. Barnsley's eyes dart left and right as he wonders which house he might be staying in. He's a bit surprised when the coach pulls up near Clapham South Underground Station. Their guide ushers them off the coach into a silo and down some stairs. Are we going on another journey? Barnsley wonders as he makes his way down 180 steps to find themselves in a long, dark tunnel. Along each wall, row after row of bunk beds. "This is it," the guide explains. "This disused World War II air raid shelter, 100 feet underground, is to be home for Barnsley and his fellow Windrush passengers." Barnsley has a restless first night, kept awake by the sound of the trains rattling above and by the sound of the children crying through the night. "I can't stay here," Barnsley thinks to himself. The next day, Barnsley rises at 6 a.m., the sounds of the trains above ringing in his ears. He eats his breakfast in the shelter canteen. After breakfast, he joins the crew at the queue at the shelter's makeshift employment office. Because of his RAF skills as a mechanic, by that afternoon, Barnsley has secured himself an engineering job. Now to find somewhere to live. Armed with a list of rooms to let, Barnsley sets out. Bounding up the stairs 2 at a time, Barnsley soon reaches the outside world. It's a cold and foggy afternoon as Barnsley makes his way briskly across Clapham Common to the first lodging on his list. But each lodging brings disappointment. Seems everywhere he goes, the room is just gone. Some lodgings make their position clear and carry signs saying, "No blacks, no Irish, no dogs." By the end of the day, Barnsley trudges wearily back to the shelter. Lying awake that night, Barnsley puts pen to paper and writes to his brother. "Dear Morgan, I have to tell you, things have changed since my last time here. During the war, we were treated well by the RAF and by the local civilians. People were kind and went out of their way to be helpful because we were all fighting for the same cause. It's as if now that the emergency is over, we are not wanted anymore. Please do not tell Audrey of my circumstances, as I do not wish that she should worry. These dirty streets don't bother me. I feel the push, but I will not fall. Yours, Barnsley." Barnsley soldiers on. He works hard, he stays in the shelter, and he saves his money. A month later, feeling that things have taken a great leap forward, Barnsley puts pen to paper and writes to his wife. My darling Audrey, my job is going well. There's a foreman job coming up and the supervisor thinks that I should get it. I have joined Sam King's partner scheme, so I will soon be able to put down a deposit on a house in Brixton town. I will write to you when I am settled. Kiss little Esme for me. Tell her daddy is safe and well in England, and I hope that we will all be together again soon. With all my love, Barnsley. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Norman. And thank you to all of our storytellers. I hope that everyone has enjoyed the sheer variety of stories we've had, this kind of from the verbal testimony all the way through to personal memories and some historical and social and cultural discussion as well. I can see some lovely comments coming through on the chat. I'm going to stop our presentation as well so that hopefully you'll be able to see more of us. I'll just welcome a couple of new people to the discussion as well. So Caroline is our volunteer manager here at the Courtauld, and she has been looking at any questions and comments that have been coming in. So Caroline, perhaps I'll hand over to you, and if there are any questions for our panelists or for Matthew, then please do share them with us and keep your questions coming in. So once more, just thank you so much to our storytellers who have been working so hard over the last couple of months to put these stories together. Over to you, Caroline.
Wow, thank you. I've been reading the chat throughout, and it's so lovely to hear kind of your memories of different places. If you've got a question, have a think now, type it in the chat box and we'll come back to it. But I just kind of wanted to start off by asking our storytellers, and if you just sort of gesture to me who would like to answer this first. But I think you've really provided such a unique insight into just what one image can start. So do you feel that studying and researching these photographs has changed your perception of London in any way? Has anything come up? Who would like to answer that first? Norman, take it away. Norman, do you want to unmute yourself? Sorry.
It's been at least a week since I've done that. Yeah, for me, finding it about the underground London, of which there's a lot of it. I think there's an air raid shelter under every tube station on the Northern Line, with the one in Clapham, I think, being the last one that was built. It was only built like about a year before the war ended. So, but I knew that the Windrush, there's a Jamaican colony in Brixton because of the connection with Clapham. But I didn't realize why until I started researching this, and didn't realize that they were all shipped to this shelter, which, as someone has put up, that shelter was used by quite a lot of people. It was actually also used as a cheap place to stay during the Festival of Britain. So just finding about subterranean London and subterranean Britain, by the way, was fascinating.
Yes, wonderful. And I think, yeah, there's been so many people in the chat that have shared their families' experiences of staying in underground shelters. And I confess I had no idea they existed quite so close to where I currently am. I'm in South London. Clapham Common's not very far away. I'd love to know if it's still there, actually.
There's actually a tour. There is actually a tour of that particular one, which I think is run by the museum, the Transport Museum. I think when lockdown is over, you can actually go and go on the tour again. So, yeah.
Brilliant. And I would also add, their tours are run by volunteers and they're supposed to be absolutely marvelous. So maybe we've got some homework to look into one of those. What about any of our other storytellers? Do you feel like your perception of London's changed a little bit from studying some of these photographs? Gill. you like to unmute yourself?
Yes, thanks, Caroline. I think just what occurred to me now really is something I've said in a previous talk, that buildings have a very long life, longer than people usually. And so an old building like that will have so many connections for different people. And just for me and the Royal Courts of Justice, you know, the fact that I was aware of that appeal case before I even came to London. It was just a news item on television where I was, you know, living in the East Midlands, and I had no idea at the time that I would be coming to London, and then taking part in a film about the case as well. And then the fact that I've walked up and down the Strand so many times since I came to London, just going from place to place. I think just the connection of a building and people, it's a constant, you know, link going on over many, many years. So it just draws everything together, I think, the whole story of it. And a building will have so many stories surrounding it, the older the building is, obviously. So I'm only saying what's obvious, but it just occurred to me just now. So
I think that you're absolutely right, and I think that Fran's talk really highlights this as well, is that, you know, places that you walk past all the time and seeing them actually change quite dramatically over a space of, you know, a number of years is really interesting. Dana, you had your hand up. Do you want to share how your perceptions changed a little?
No, I was just going to say something similar to what Gill mentioned, and I completely agree that buildings and architecture in general influences the lives of so many people that maybe pass by it every day, or they're just visiting. And yeah, it did kind of spark my interest, because I didn't think about, for example, when was the first Loewe shop opened in London. It didn't even cross my mind. So having to dig about it and to know what, you know, the building was prior to that, etc., also made me realize that there was a Roman settlement in there, as probably there was in many parts of London, but it's just so interesting that, you know, history stretches back so much sometimes.
Absolutely, I agree. And I think that someone in the chat wrote how much they would love to be a Bond Street lounger. And I think that just sounds like a lovely way to spend time. And someone else mentioned the Elizabeth Arden door, and they're wondering if it was one of the salons. So I think that, like, there's a few things to investigate for a lot of this after this as well.
Yeah, I think it was just a shop, like it was not a big shop, because now Tiffany's kind of like has expanded and occupies now the 3 shops, and I think it was just like a side shop, like the clockmakers on the other side. So I don't think it was a salon. It was, I mean, one could dream and think it was a salon. That's fine as well.
It was absolutely incredible how quickly, I think it was Rachel, figured out that it was Tiffany. Her knowledge of Old Bond Street is truly, truly impressive. And Jill, I could not believe it when someone in the chat, Jeanette, mentioned about being at school and remembering the Oz trial and wanting to go and watch it. And I just couldn't believe the chances of them predicting that after all of the famous cases at the Royal Courts of London, that is the same one. So it's lovely to hear that the people attending are on the same wavelength as our volunteers as well.
Yes, it's probably one of the highest profile cases because it was so, you know, covered so much in the media at the time. So
wonderful. Fran, you have raised your hand.
Yeah, I'm going to take the cheeky opportunity to ask a question of Matthew while we have them in the room. It doesn't have to be a Conway Library image, but I wondered if there have been any records added to Layers of London which have kind of told you something that you don't know, and whether you have any favourites.
That's a big question. Yes, probably most of them actually. I think one of the early images that someone uploaded, which in a sense didn't really mean anything to me at all at the time, was an image of a fig tree that someone posted, and it meant a lot to the people who posted it, because it was a fig tree planted in I think it was the Isle of Dogs, and it was planted in the late 1940s by a greengrocer who had some figs on his tray. He planted this fig tree, and his son went back sort of 80 years later and rediscovered this fig tree that was planted by his father, and it sort of was a way of unlocking all the memories about his father and his business back in the 1940s and what life was like on the Isle of Dogs back in those days. So it was sort of a way of triggering memory for somebody. And it was great also that this fig tree is now being it's got a preservation order on it from the city mayor of London. So that's just one example of a very sort of personal image that you can use to unlock stories about London life, London work, shops, businesses 70, 80 years ago. So that was a very early sort of contribution to the website, and it really sort of resonated because it made that we very clearly saw that there's huge potential with this thing we've created to unlock all those stories. And I think buildings also have the same function, because they unlock stories. They seem as if they're sort of very static, but of course, as we've seen from these wonderful talks, they're not static. They change. They're covered with soot for part of their history. They're cleaned up. And each of those sorts of parts of their lives of these buildings unlocks different kinds of stories, whether it's the Royal Courts of Justice, in particular, all the events that have happened around there. So I think buildings are sort of trigger points, if you like, for wonderful stories. And I think trying to record those stories is what we're all about, really.
Wonderful. And I think it's really testament to what a photograph can spark, because our volunteers have went and researched these images and explored their own narratives, but then also so many people in the chat who are listening are sharing their own stories of these places, and I think that's really wonderful. Someone mentioned that Crocker's Folly that you talked about, Dora, used to be their father's local pub, and they used to go all the time, and I thought that was really lovely. I think quite a few of us are putting it on our list of places to go after the pandemic has kind of eased a bit. I wonder if you mentioned the man in the corner with his dog, and quite a few people were agreeing with you in terms of the social isolation and the importance of pubs. How do you think that the past few days have gone now that people are able to go back into the pubs again? Do you think it's lovely seeing people in them?
It certainly has changed the lives of many people just to get back to normality, really. I totally enjoyed this research, and making the story up. It's been a pleasure. Just to see how a building can sparkle so much narrative in a social context, into a psychological context, and also just parallel with our lives today. I mean, nobody would have dreamed about a pandemic, how this would have been taken away from our lives. From some people is a social place to go, and then taken away and making life even more difficult. So I agree with you. The pub is totally, it's got it can be invested in much more these days, although it doesn't exist as it was originally. The Crown is a restaurant at the moment, but that room is still intact. They've done a fabulous job in preserving not only the features but also the function of that room. So yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And someone asked that actually, but you answered it beautifully as part of your talk. They were wondering if the windows are still intact, and it's lovely to hear that it's been preserved so intently. We also had some great insight into what goes on at the Royal Courts of London from somebody who used to work there, talking about the plush carpets in the judges' offices, which I just think is something that we would never have found out about until this very talk kind of occurred. I'm just going to throw it out to the rest of the panel if anyone has any final parting thoughts, because we've had lots of fantastic feedback in the chat. Thank you so much, but not really that many questions. So if we have any questions from within ourselves, I'll give you the opportunity to ask any. Everyone's so delighted with finishing their talks. Tom, you've unmuted yourself.
Oh, if you can hear me, I was just going to say that I think one of the really saddest things about the pandemic is that we haven't been able to handle photographs. And something I know that we always try to do when people volunteer with us or take part in the project is to give them photographs. And it's always a very important thing to put something in somebody's hand and let them hold this physical object, because of course, they're not just holding an image, they're holding a piece of cardboard that perhaps had an interesting voyage, an interesting journey into the Courtauld itself. As some of you may know, we have photographs in our collection that were taken by, but also printed by Lawrence of Arabia. So goodness knows what journey they took to actually come into the Conway Library. So I'm really looking forward to getting back into the physical library and being able to go through that process again and give people photographs, especially if they resonate with them. And I know Norman mentioned the Festival of Britain. We have a wonderful box about the Festival of Britain, and it's a lovely thing to give somebody to that box and allow them to sit down and look through it. And something that we can obviously never capture again online.
Yes, absolutely. And someone has just asked a question, and they've asked, are all of your digital resources available to non-students? So while you're non-muted, Tom, do you want to mention a little bit about the digitisation of these collections?
Well, the digitisation, thank goodness, our main funder is the National Lottery, and they have made it a condition of their funding that we publish this collection online, free of charge for anybody to use and to download, but also to make use of these images in their own projects. So whether that's just making a fabulous t-shirt, or whether it's to do something with the school group or whatever, or just for your own enjoyment and fun, I think that's a real key to democratizing this collection, because it means that the use to which you put one of these images is no better or no less than the use to which somebody else might put it. So it might appear in a book, or it might appear on your wall at home, or it might be part of some amazing treasure hunt that you plan around wherever it is. But I think giving things away is the way to go, and we're profoundly grateful for the lottery for giving us this pointer.
Wonderful. And yes, Matthew, I saw you were doing lots of nodding. Are you kind of in agreement about, I think the democratization of images is a good topic?
Absolutely, I think, and it's both the democratization of images and video and sources, but also the democratization of history itself and heritage and the kinds of stories we can tell about the past, which are not just the stories that are sort of written by academic historians, if you like, but by people who know those stories and can research them themselves. I think these images are a way to unlock that again, as I said earlier.
Absolutely. And we've had a few questions for Norman about the Fate of Barnsley that's come in via the chat. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that, Norman.
Yeah, the Fate of Barnsley. You can probably find out more about the Fate of Barnsley because I'm going to do a follow-up to this. But Barnsley is an amalgam of a lot of people, including my own parents. So there were different people who did spend a whole month down there. A lot of people did end up in Brixton and are living there today. Unfortunately, I think some of them also got caught up in the Windrush scandal, controversy. So despite all of this, a few years ago, they were sort of imprisoned and kicked out of the country because the government didn't keep the papers. And because they changed their citizenship, when people came over on the Windrush, they came over as British citizens with British passports. And then the 1971 Immigration Act took away their British citizenship, which meant that some people, including my parents, had to reapply for British citizenship. And some people only just kept a leave to stay. So they ended up not having the paperwork that allowed them to stay. Some of the other people, I mentioned Sam King, in there, and he did actually start a partner scheme, and he did help people, same as we did with my parents, buy houses. And Sam King ended up being the mayor of Lambeth. So these are some of the other, sort of many, sort of Windrush, stories. I think a couple of other people stayed in the RAF and did all right. And I think a couple of the similar people went back to different parts of the Caribbean, and one became the prime minister of his country, and things like that. But the research that I got, apart from through the Courtauld and things like that, was from the RAF Museum. So if you go to the RAF Museum and site, you can see quite a bit of the sort of history of a lot of the characters that this is based on. And the same with the Imperial War Museum, that's just down the road. And Matthew put up a link to the Layers of London Windrush file, which I decided to look at, so you can sort of have a look at that. But let's say Barnsley did all right. He went, lived in Brixton, brought his family over, because just to finish, that was the case with a lot of people, as it was with my parents, that my father came over first and left the family behind. Had to find somewhere to live, find a job, and then later brought the family over. Some I know their families didn't come over, and I know that some, because of the treatment, went back to Jamaica or went back to the Caribbean. But it's all fascinating stories, really. So, but Barnsley, I think Barnsley did all right.
Wonderful. So a few people have been asking in the chat about volunteering, because obviously we have here a group of our volunteers who've been supporting this event this evening. We have volunteers who are doing remote things at the minute, because obviously we haven't been able to physically get into the Conway Library at the Courtauld in Somerset House. So I've just put the link to our remote volunteering project, which is called Zooniverse. It's on the Zooniverse platform, and you can explore different elements of the collection. So it's organised by country, and if you'd like to get involved, you can help us transcribe the information on the card mounts, which is what some of the information you've seen this evening has been taken from those as well. So it's a great way to just have a snippet of their collection and help us digitise things for people around the world to be able to use and create their own stories about. Right, I think that's probably it for us. If you've got any final thoughts or questions, you have our email address, so please do get in touch. And Fran, I believe you have your hand up. Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much for all of your questions, and thank you, Caroline, for chairing the Q&A. So we have recorded today's session. In a couple of days' time, I'll send everybody who attended a message, and it will have a link to watch this again if you would like, or perhaps you want to send it to family or friends. So please do share it widely. In the email, I'll also include a link to Layers of London so that you can explore all the amazing collections and records on there. And we've seen a few links shared in the chat today, so I'll compile all of those together so that you can revisit them at your leisure. So really just thank you so much again to our fabulous storytellers. It's been such an enjoyable evening for me. I've just been relaxing and listening to your stories. And thank you, Professor Davies, for joining us as well. It's so lovely to kind of be able to collaborate with Layers of London on this, because so much about what we've been doing during the pandemic is collaborative, so it's a lovely event for us to do. Can see lots of thank yous coming through on the chat, so please do send in your well wishes quickly, because I think this meeting will end pretty soon after we say goodbye. So for now, I don't know if everyone wants to sort of unmute and we can be a cacophony of goodbyes. So thank you very much, everybody, and have lovely evenings wherever you are in the world.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
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 Thank you. Bye.